Do you know where the term redneck comes from? Do you know what the largest insurrection was to occur in the United States behind the Civil War? And how does a secret Irish society play into any of it? Well, what if I told you the answer to these questions are one and the same? And it's what we'll be discussing on this week's episode of Learning Out Loud. Hi, I'm Katie, the host of Learning Out Loud, a podcast where we explore history's pivotal moments with curiosity and compassion. We're continuing our series, American Rebellions, and this week we find ourselves in the Appalachia area of West Virginia in the early 1900s, where coal miners were being treated very poorly by the coal mine owners and denied even the most basic rights. This week we'll be talking about the West Virginia Coal Mine Wars, which took place between 1912 and 1922. We'll be exploring the question that many coal miners faced, and frankly, a question that I think is becoming more prevalent today. Do you accept the status quo, or do you stand up and fight for what's right? As Mother Jones, an important figure of this conflict, and we'll learn more about her in a bit, said at the time, quote, "There is never peace in West Virginia because there is never justice," end quote. Before we get started, I wanted to mention that all of the sources I use for this episode are in the episode description, but I wanted to shout out two important sources in particular. A book I read called The Devil is Here in These Hills, West Virginia's Coal Miners and Their Battle for Freedom by labor historian James R. Green. This book is the only one of its kind that has all of the history of the West Virginia coal mining wars and its origins from 1890 to 1933. The other source that I wanted to shout out in particular was the National Park Service. I know that we typically think of the National Park Service, or NPS, as park rangers who work at the national parks. You know, they help you when you're lost, or they might provide you with hiking trails and tips. But there are many NPS designated areas throughout the U.S. that are actually historical areas. For example, the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island off of New York are a part of the National Park Service. And they actually have a specific program for history called the Park History Program, and it's been around for 100 years. And to quote from their website, they, quote, "preserve and protect our nation's cultural and natural resources by aiding in and undertaking historical research, documentation, training, and interpretation," end quote, on many different areas, including the National Park Service, National Historic Landmarks, oral histories, special history studies, etc. They also administer a ton of different programs like the African American Civil Rights Network, American World War II Heritage City programs, maritime heritage programs and grants, and so on and so on. I've also included the link to their What We Do page if you wanted to read more about it. I thought it was pretty interesting because I knew that historical landmarks were part of the NPS, but I didn't know that they had this whole separate entity that did historical research, and I thought that was pretty cool. And as of this recording, March 3rd, 2025, Elon Musk and Doge have fired over 1,000 national park employees, but due to major backlash and protests, I found an article where they said that they were going to rehire 50 essential employees and promised to hire about 7,700 seasonal workers, but we'll see about that. But more importantly, the administration has also stated that they want to sell off, aka privatize, U.S. forests and national parks in order to strip the lands of their resources and make money off of it. And that's going to come into play later, actually. But anywho, on a lighter note, I thought it would be interesting to see if there were any movies or documentaries on the coal mine wars for our friends out there who might find reading a historical nonfiction, somewhat academic book that Green's book is. Let's just say maybe they find that a little boring. Well, good news, there are multiple movies and a documentary that's actually based off James Green's book. And I watched them. The documentary is from PBS, and it's called The Mine Wars. It's very good, and it actually includes interviews with Green and other historians, as well as videos and photographs from the actual places and time. There is a 1987 historical fiction movie based off the mine wars called Matewan. And yes, I watched it. It was okay. I thought it was a little bit boring, but James Earl Jones is in it. And then there is another historical fiction movie called The Molly McGuires. It's from 1970 and stars Sean Connery. Also pretty good. So yeah, I'm out here watching movies for y'all, dear listeners. That's how much I love you. And then some other fun recs I have for you. A related but not related book is called Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. That was one of my, I'd say, top 5 reads from last year. It's kind of set in the West Virginia area. But yeah, you can read more about it. Then there's a book called Storming Heaven by Denise Giardina. It's a historical fiction that takes place during the coal mine wars. I haven't read it yet, but it has a 4.11 star rating on Goodreads. And we'll actually be hearing more from Giardina later on in the episode. So that's all I'll say for now. Then there is a season on American Storytellers, which is a podcast by Wondery and hosted by Lindsey Graham. But no, not the congressperson Lindsey Graham. It's season 27, and it's called Coal Wars. And then, of course, this episode of Learning Out Loud. Jesus to camera. All right, but now for real, let's get into it. And you already know the drill. We start with some background, bitches. All right. So the Second Industrial Revolution occurred in the United States shortly after the Civil War in 1870 and lasted through the early 1900s. The biggest inventions to come out of the Industrial Revolution were new ways to produce iron and steam engines, which were used in boats, factories, railroads. You get the picture. And what do these all have in common? They use coal as a fuel source. Not surprisingly, coal mining exploded during this time, particularly in Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and Colorado. The expansion of the railroads allowed for coal to be easily shipped from rural coal fields of West Virginia. So they were kind of like the newcomer to the coal game. During this time, railroad and coal mining owners became some of the most powerful and wealthy men in America. And just a little side note, for those of y'all who listened to the Manhattan Draft Riots episode, and if you haven't, go back and listen to it. Some of these men were the men that we talked about who paid the $300 fee to avoid being drafted in the Civil War. Interesting, no? Coal mining was very dangerous work. Between 1880 and 1923, 70,000 miners died on the job. Many more died from occupational diseases like black lung, but there's no official statistic on that. Miners could be killed by machinery, mine shaft collapses, or gas explosions. In 1900, a major mining accident occurred in Utah, killing 201 people. In 1907, 2 more major mine disasters occurred within 2 weeks of each other. One in West Virginia and one in Pennsylvania, killing 362 and 239 people respectively. Miners would call that winter season, quote, explosion season, end quote, because the dry air amplified the dangers from methane and coal dust. Although these major accidents were devastating and made national headlines, it was much more common for frequent, smaller accidents that killed 1 or 2 miners at a time. I feel like this quote from an article I read, written by Trish Kale, sums up the coal mining industry during this time. Quote, as urban energy intensification made cities safer, healthier, and more convenient during the Progressive Era, the everyday violence of the energy system was largely hidden from view in rural mining communities, end quote. So who worked in these dangerous coal mines? Great question. It was a diverse mix of people ranging from poor whites and newly emancipated black people from the South and immigrants. Coal company representatives went as far as to travel to struggling towns in southern and eastern Europe, promising to pay the voyage fare and guaranteed work in the coal fields. By the beginning of the 1900s, there were close to 500,000 people working in the coal mines. The coal companies preyed on desperate people, and the way the coal mining operations were set up, it was very difficult to leave your coal mining job to start over somewhere else. Let me briefly describe what it was like to be a coal miner so that you'll understand what I mean when I say most of the workers became stuck working in the coal mines. Most of the coal mining areas, like we said, were in very rural areas, far from established cities or towns. So coal companies would come in and set up entire mini towns to entice workers. On paper, it seemed like a really nice, idealistic way to set up a utopian-like workers' village. Coal companies would build churches, schools, libraries, general stores, and housing for their workers. Since the companies provided everything workers and their families needed, they paid their workers in what was called scrip, which was only good at company stores. It was not real money. And because the companies also owned the stores and there was no outside competition, they would charge crazy high prices, which would cause the workers to rack up debts that they were required to pay before they could leave. And since they were only paid in scrip, there was no way for workers to create any sort of meaningful savings. Coal miners were paid by the ton, which was a measurement for how much coal they mined per day. They were often cheated out of wages in this regard because the mining operators often changed the definition of what a ton was or would manipulate the scales in order to pay the miners less. Miners would also sometimes take coal from other workers' mining carts in order to add more weight to their own haul, and this often went unpunished. Mining companies also employed their own private security, often through Baldwin Felts agency, or they would pay local sheriffs. And though they claimed this was to protect their workers, the security forces were mostly to make sure the workers stayed in line and didn't form unions or uprisings. Even the most basic freedoms like freedom of speech, movement, and assembly were greatly restricted by these private mine guards. Overall, the mining operations were highly exploitative to a group and class of people who were already largely discriminated against. And sadly, working in these conditions were the best case scenario that they thought they could get. Remember, this is a time period where Reconstruction efforts in the South have been abandoned, and we see the rise of segregation and Jim Crow laws and violence against Black people. And there's still also a lot of discrimination against immigrants. And speaking of immigrants, while I was doing research for the Coal Mine Wars of West Virginia, I came across another story that I thought was really interesting, and I wanted to share it with you very briefly. It is a story about a legendary group called the Molly McGuires. Now, this group is a real group and can be traced back to the 1840s in Ireland. A widow named Molly McGuire led a group of protesters against English landlords, and she and her group were known to get into fistfights with the landlords to try to keep their land and dignity. Their violence became well known, and members were known to say, quote, "Take that from a son of Molly McGuire," end quote, after beating someone up. The group later became known as the Molly McGuires after their leader. Now, we know from our last episode that over 1 million Irish immigrated to the U.S. during the Great Potato Famine, and while we discussed the Irish who settled into New York City, there was also a significant number that moved into the coal mining regions of Pennsylvania. Sadly, they were escaping horrific living conditions and the brutal tyranny of England, only to find conditions in the U.S. were not so great either. The Irish faced religious and ethnic discrimination in the U.S., and many places would include on their help wanted signs, "No Irish need apply." And that's something we talked about in the Manhattan Draft Riots episode. When they did find work, they found themselves working in the most dangerous and horrendous conditions in the U.S. for that time: coal mining. The Irish decided to form their own group, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, or AOH, to fight for equality and fairness for the Irish working class. So here's where the Molly McGuires come onto the scene. It is believed that they popped up in the Pennsylvania coal region in order to fight for the coal miners' rights, but there's never been any concrete evidence to confirm their existence in Pennsylvania at all during this time, which is pretty crazy. That being said, most historians have accepted their existence as fact in Pennsylvania at this time. It is believed that the AOH was a cover for the Molly McGuires. And while the AOH pushed for changes through legal and legislative measures, the Molly McGuires would try to make the changes through force. But improvement for coal miner safety and working conditions were difficult to achieve. This led to what was called the Long Strike of 1875, and I got most of this information from Penn State University's library website. This was the first important open coal dispute in the coal region of Pennsylvania. It was also the scene for some of the most violent crimes in labor history. Both the unions and coal companies were responsible for numerous violent acts during the strike, including brawls, sabotage, and even coordinated murder. The coal authorities formed a police force whose sole purpose was to kill violent strikers. But the violence was getting out of hand, so the coal companies decided to send in a spy named James McParland, as a native Irishman, and worked for the infamous Pinkerton Detective Agency. With McParland's spying, the police were able to arrest over 60 men who they accused of being linked to the Molly McGuires. This massive arrest was enough to end the miner strike, but that wasn't enough for the coal mine owners. From 1875 to 1877, a series of trials were held in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. Side note, that's also where the oldest brewery in the U.S. is located, and that's Yuengling. I went there last October, and I had no idea that this other historical event took place there, and I'm so annoyed because I could have seen some of these historical markers and places. Anyway, although the trials could not provide any evidence that the Molly McGuires actually even existed, the media still referred to these men by that name. The trials resulted in 20 men being sentenced to hang. Not only that, they were also excommunicated from the Catholic Church and denied a proper Christian burial. In 1979, John Kehoe, labeled as the king of the Molly McGuires, was granted a full pardon by the state of Pennsylvania. To date, official documentation that the Molly McGuires ever existed in America has never been produced, but their legend will not be forgotten. After the hangings, the coal miners and the Irish community regarded the Molly McGuires as heroes. They admired their courage and determination through one of the most difficult union movements ever recorded. The Molly McGuires are recorded as the first worker-only labor movement in American history, but it would not be the last. Sadly, the fight for coal miner safety, fair pay, and treatment would continue into the 1900s, and it would be just as violent. And this leads us back to West Virginia. In 1890, the United Mine Workers of America, also known as UMW or UMWA, was formed and quickly became the largest union in the U.S. before World War I. The union was integrated, and their constitution read, quote, "No local union or assembly is justified in discriminating against any person in securing or retaining work because of their African descent," end quote. African Americans were also hired as union organizers. They were able to successfully unionize several of the northern U.S. coal mining areas, but they did not venture down into West Virginia. Green writes that, quote, "Union affairs were integrated perhaps to a greater extent than anywhere else in industrial America at the time," end quote. This led to West Virginia coal mine companies being able to sell their coal for less than the unionized North and still make huge profits because they were able to pay their workers so little and also charge exorbitant fees at the general stores. And they made it very difficult for unions to even get into their coal mining towns, so their workers couldn't do much about pay or working conditions. And this leads us to the coal mine wars of West Virginia. I want to start off by introducing two important figures of the West Virginia coal mine wars. First, we briefly mentioned her in the intro, and that is Mother Jones. Government name, Mary Harris Jones. Born in 1837 in County Cork, Ireland, she moved with her family to Canada when she was 5, just before the potato famine hit Ireland. She moved to Chicago and worked first as a teacher, then as a seamstress. She then moved to Memphis, Tennessee for another teaching job, and there she married a man named George Jones in 1861. He was a member of the Iron Molders Union. They had 4 kids within 6 years. And then she was sadly struck by back-to-back tragedies. First, she lost her entire family to a yellow fever epidemic in 1867. She dressed in all black for the rest of her life. She moved back to Chicago and went back to sewing, but then she lost everything she owned in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. She could not catch a break. And now that she had lost her entire family and all her material possessions, this, you could say, could very well ruin even the most hardy of people, but not Mother Jones. She decides to turn her efforts and time into helping working people who are being taken advantage of as the Industrial Revolution took off. The first strike that she participated in was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, again in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Throughout her lifetime, she participated in hundreds of strikes. She became a beloved leader of strikes and union fights, and this is where she gets the nickname Mother Jones. Starting in 1900, she started focusing her efforts in the coal mines of Pennsylvania and West Virginia. She was actually briefly employed by the United Mine Workers, but she left when leadership disavowed a wildcat strike in Colorado, which she participated in. And a wildcat strike is when workers strike without their union's permission. I won't get too much into her involvement in the West Virginia coal mines because we'll actually integrate that into the story later. I just wanted to give you a picture of who she was. Despite her radicalism, she did not believe in women's rights to vote. She argued that, quote, "you don't need a vote to raise hell," end quote. Jones believed that suffragists were naive women who unwittingly acted as duplicitous agents of class warfare. She felt that a woman's place was in the home and that men should be paid well enough that women wouldn't have to work. Regardless, she became the most famous, or should I say infamous, female labor activist of the 19th and early 20th century. A U.S. attorney called her, quote, "the most dangerous woman in America," end quote. Then let's just say you didn't fuck with Mother Jones. And next, another important character we have is a man named Frank Keeney. He was just 10 years old when his father died, and he had to go work in the coal mines to support his mother and all his siblings. The legal working age in West Virginia at the time was 12, but most coal operators didn't follow the law anyway, and there were a lot of young boys working in the mines. His job was to sit in the dark and wait to open and close the tunnel doors for the coal miners, and he did this for 11 hours a day. At 10 years old. Keeney met Mother Jones when he was a teenager, and she saw his potential and took him under her wing and would play an influential role in his rise as a union leader. She told him to leave the pool halls and pick up books if he wanted to improve his situation. And Keeney would be involved in all of the coal mine wars and related activities. All right, so let's talk briefly about the lead up to the coal mine wars in West Virginia. In 1902, 86% of West Virginia coal miners went on strike to show solidarity with miners who were striking in eastern Pennsylvania. They were quickly kicked out of the company-owned housing and towns, and this was a decision that was held up by West Virginia courts. So what the coal miners did was set up tent colonies along strips of land that the mine operators did not own. Mother Jones was arrested as one of the leaders of this West Virginia strike and found guilty of ignoring an injunction that banned meetings of striking miners. This was when she was called the most dangerous woman in America, and that was by District Attorney Reese Blizzard. And by the way, I just like to point out that during this time, women did not have many legal rights, including the right to vote. That's still a couple decades away. So I think it's pretty impressive that she had so many men in authority positions afraid of her. It just goes to show that ordinary people can have an incredible influence and help lead really important causes. And I mean, in her mind, she was right that she could still raise hell without her vote. You don't have to have a fancy Ivy League education or come from extreme wealth to affect change in the world, despite what those in power may have you believe. Despite the record number of West Virginia strikers, the Union decided to pull much of its support from West Virginia to focus on the strike in Pennsylvania, which left many West Virginia strikers out of options to support themselves and their families financially. So eventually some of the strikers returned to work in the coal mines. About a year later, on the morning of February 25th, 1903, Deputy U.S. Marshal Dan Cunningham led an armed group into the town called Staniford in West Virginia, where striking miners were still living. They opened fire on multiple homes as they walked through the residential street. They killed 6 men, with some killed in their own beds. The marshal and his men were found not guilty by a judge because they were trying to execute a lawful arrest. Several days before the February 25th incident, the marshal had been stopped by miners in the town from serving court papers. But this violent event seemed like revenge and that they were out for blood. Another source I read said that this was also revenge for the striking miners because they attended a union meeting. So I guess literally going to a meeting, you can be killed for that. In America, in the 1900s. Then in 1907, the deadliest U.S. mining accident occurred in West Virginia, which we briefly mentioned in the beginning, and this killed 425 men. West Virginia had the highest death rate of all mining areas in the country. There were few mining safety laws on record, and the few that were not enforced because that actually ate into the mine operators' profits. The violence from law enforcement, the failed strikes, and the deadliest mining accident, not to mention the general backbreaking work that was required, low wages, feeling trapped in the mining towns, it's easy to see that West Virginia coal miners were coming close to their wits' end in terms of putting up with these awful conditions. Something had to change. They had asked for help from the unions, from their elected officials, but they were repeatedly rejected and ignored. And this brings up the question I asked in the intro. Do you just accept the status quo, or do you take a stand and fight for what is right? So that leads us into the first mine war, 1912 to 1913. In 1912, thousands of coal miners in the Kanawha and New River areas of West Virginia went on a wildcat strike because mine operators refused to grant a modest wage increase to make pay similar to other regional companies. Soon after, 7,500 more coal miners in nearby Cabin Creek joined the strike. In response, the coal operators started forcibly evicting the coal miners and their families from their homes, again, because the operators owned them. And again, the same thing happens where all of the striking miners and their families move into encampments on land not owned by the operators. This time, the coal miners decided to fight back, and this turned into a 13-month-long struggle that in the end left 25 men dead. Although the miners had initiated the strike on their own, once word got around about the scale of the strike and the strikers getting kicked out of their homes, the UMW decided to help out, including sending Mother Jones and Union VP Frank Hayes. The coal operators responded by recruiting strikebreakers and hiring 300 Baldwin-Felts agents to bust the strike. The Baldwin-Felts agents built forts outfitted with machine guns throughout the Paint Creek and Cabin Creek strike areas. They also blocked roads out of the area and guarded the train stations to prevent any of the strikers from getting out, and they would beat anyone that they caught trying to leave. In July, Mother Jones led a group of 3,000 armed miners to the steps of the state capitol to read a declaration of war to Governor William Glasscock. I'd like to note that Mother Jones would often refer to Governor Glasscock as Crystal Peter. Get it? At the end of the month, a group of miners attacked a town called Mucklow, leaving 12 strikers and 4 guards dead. Governor William Glasscock eventually declared martial law in September and sent the National Guard to stop the fighting between the miners and the owners' hired guards. The commander of the National Guard, General Charles Elliott, wrote a report back to Glasscock saying that the mine owners' quest for dividends had led to the degradation and impoverishment of their employees. He wrote, quote, "The devil is here in these hills, and the devil is greed," end quote. It wasn't very hard to see that the horrible conditions the mine owners had put their workers in was what was causing the violent resistance. Martial law was lifted in October, but then reinstated in November, and then lifted again in January. One of the most violent acts by the Baldwin Felts agents during this time was called the Nighttime Ride of the Bull Moose Special. It was in retaliation after the Mucklow attack by the strikers. The Bull Moose Special was a train car that was reinforced with iron plating and machine guns. On the night of February 7th, 1913, coal operator Quinn Martin and Kanawha Sheriff Bonner Hill turned off the lights on the train and drove through Holly Grove, a tent colony the Union had established for striking miners and their families, and fired indiscriminately into the homes and tents. Several men were killed, but one murder stood out and enraged the miners and the nation. An Italian miner named Francesco Estep was shot in the face while protecting his pregnant wife. This made national papers, and one merchant was so upset with the news that he actually sent guns and ammunition to the strikers. Mucklow was then attacked for a third time by strikers after this, leaving 2 people dead, and then martial law was imposed for the third and final time. However, it was clear the National Guard was there to get the miners back to work. There had been no other time in U.S. history where martial law was executed to the extent that it was in West Virginia during the first coal mine war. Soldiers arrested 200 strikers without warrant, including Mother Jones, jailed them, and tried them in a military tribunal. And what will probably be a shock to no one, none of the guards or coal operators received any punishment for their roles in the coal mine war. And that kind of reminds me of the TikTok audio that's going around where it's like, and when they say the government would never do that, oh, yes, they would. Because I feel like that's something like, oh, well, they would never impose martial law and then arrest a bunch of people and put them in front of military tribunals. It's like, no, they would. And they did. And who's to say that they wouldn't do that again? Anyways, Mother Jones was charged by the military courts for inciting riot. The inciting event was reportedly reading from the Declaration of Independence. Go figure. And later for conspiracy to commit murder. She's such a badass. She refused to recognize the jurisdiction of the military court and refused to enter a plea. She was sentenced to 20 years in state penitentiary where she caught pneumonia. She was allowed to transfer to a boarding house for house arrest after getting sick, but the new governor, Dr. Henry D. Hatfield, released her without comment after 85 days of imprisonment. The new governor also went to the area immediately after being sworn in to try to get things under control. He released 30 prisoners held under martial law, and he gave the other strikers the option to either leave the state or sign what became known as Hatfield Contract. Most of the strikers accepted Hatfield's somewhat reasonable terms in May of 1913. The Union and Paint Creek mining companies agreed to a 9-hour workday, accountability for miner compensation, and protection from backlash for union membership. Things went back to how life was for the most part before the coal mine war, with not much improvement to the West Virginia coal miners' lives. The unsatisfactory resolution of the first mine war would stay with the West Virginia miners, and just a few years later, in 1920, we see the start of the Second Coal Mine War. The Second Mine War got started in 1920 with a strike by miners in a town called Matewan in Mingo County. This strike stemmed from the owners' continued use of armed private mine guards and using them to stop the miners' attempts at organizing. Similarly to how the first mine war started, the owners refused to compromise, brought back in the Baldwin Felts agents, and kicked everyone out of their homes. On May 19, 1920, the Matewan Town Sheriff, Sid Hatfield, yes, it's another Hatfield, and yes, the Governor Hatfield and Sheriff Hatfield are related, and yes, it's that Hatfield as in the Hatfield McCoys, although not by blood. And we can do an episode on them later. Anywho, Sid Hatfield was not, he was a little bit different. He was a different type of sheriff for that area. He actually wasn't having any of the Baldwin Felts bullshit in his town. Him and Mayor Testerman, they confronted two of the agents, and they were actually brothers, and they were Felts, as in the Baldwin Felts. And Sid and the mayor were asking for the agents' warrants for the evictions. They start arguing back and forth, and both parties claim that they can arrest the other. This kind of draws a crowd out. The rest of the Baldwin Felts agents are down the road a little ways down. The argument became violent when someone fired their gun. A shootout ensued, and when it was all over, 7 agents and 2 townspeople were dead, including the mayor. During the Mine Wars documentary, it was mentioned that there were people firing from the second floors of the shops in town, which some historians have argued that means, or that is proof that this was a setup by Sid Hatfield, but we don't know 100% if it was. This later became known as the Matewan Massacre and added even more fuel to the fire. By July of that year, over 90% of Mingo County miners had pledged to the Union oath. Remarkably, Sid Hatfield escaped injury and became a symbol of the miners' struggle against the violence of the mine guards. However, sadly, Mayor Testerman did die in the shootout. Sid Hatfield and his deputy sheriff, Ed Chambers, were brought to trial for their part in the Matewan Massacre. This trial got pretty messy, with the prosecution accusing Sid of killing the mayor himself. And why, might you ask? Well, because Sid and the mayor's wife actually got married just 2 weeks after the Matewan Massacre. And one of the witnesses, a spy for the Baldwin Felts agents, claimed that he heard Sid brag about shooting the mayor. Despite this scandalous part of the trial, Hatfield was actually acquitted of murder charges, although he did have other cases pending for an incident that occurred in Mohawk, a nearby coal town. He was accused, along with Chambers, of exploding a piece of coal mining machinery. And by the way, Hatfield is 28 years old and Chambers is only 22, so they're pretty young. So, they show up to the court hearing on August 1st, 1921, along with their wives and lawyers. They were told not to bring any guns or weapons with them, which makes sense because, you're going into the courthouse. However, they were being set up because there were Baldwin Felts agents waiting for them and gunned them down in broad daylight in front of a bunch of witnesses on the steps of the courthouse. And spoiler alert, the Baldwin Felt agents are never brought to justice. And sadly, both Sid Hatfield and Ed Chambers were executed. Union leaders Frank Keeney and Ed Mooney submitted a list of demands following the brazen murders of Hatfield and Chambers to the West Virginia governor, who is now, at this time, a man named Ephraim Morgan, with their biggest grievance being the brutality of the Baldwin Felts agents that act as guards in the mining towns. Governor Morgan refused to intervene or to do anything to help them. So Keeney Mooney and the rest of the miners are like, all right, bet. After the governor's rejection, thousands of miners met up in a small town called Marmet in Kanawha County. They wanted to avenge the murders of Hatfield and Chambers, as well as free the miners that were still in jail under martial law that was still being imposed in Mingo County. And a quote from Green, quote, "What began as a mass protest march now took on the menacing look of a war maneuver by more than 8,000 armed citizens under the command of miners with combat experience from both the Spanish-American War and World War I," end quote. And here is a very interesting little fun fact that I didn't know about. The miners all wore red bandanas on their march, and when reporters on the scene noticed, they began referring to the miners as rednecks. So there you go. That's where the term comes from. And they were like, and the miners were like, hey, you know what's actually on the way to Mingo County? Logan County, home to Sheriff Don Chafin, who took money from coal mine operators to enforce their interests. And you could say he was not very well liked by the miners. And they, just on the way, they thought they'd maybe pay him a little visit to, confront him or, kill him. And so by August 25th, it had become the largest civil insurrection the country had experienced since the Civil War. But Sheriff Chaffin, he must have heard about their march or spotted them in enough time to gather up his own army of civilians, and set them up along the Blair Mountain Ridgeline, which was where the miners would have to pass through to get to him, basically. And so this started the Battle of Blair Mountain on the night of August 30th, when 70 miners marched up to the mountain ahead of the rest of the group and came across some of Chaffin's deputies. A gun battle broke out and one of Chaffin's men was killed. The battle continued for the next 3 days, with both sides using Gatling guns, rifles, and other firearms. And again, this is two civilian armies, with both sides having veterans from the Spanish-American War and World War I. And in the documentary, The Mine Wars, the historians talk about how this was a full-on war battle with defenses set up, very close to hand-to-hand combat. It was gnarly. On the second day of fighting, Chaffin ordered his men to fly airplanes over the encamped marchers and drop 2 different types of bombs. There was 1 gas bomb and 2 bombs filled with gunpowder, nuts, and bolts. And again, let's just reiterate the fact that this was American citizens being bombed on American soil by American law enforcement. Something that we'll be talking about in a later episode, this is not the last time that something like this happens. After several days of fighting, the miners were ready to move into Logan County, but the federal government stepped in by dispatching 2,100 U.S. Army infantrymen, planes, and munitions to the area. It would be the largest peacetime deployment the Army had undertaken since 1890. This effectively ended the miners' march before they could start a full-on war with Chaffin's army. The miners willingly surrendered to the federal troops in early September 1921. They saw military intervention as a victory because it signaled that rule of law would finally return to the area and that the military would help protect them from the mine operators. All right, so now that the wars are over, we get to the treason trials. After fighting ended, Governor Morgan wanted to press federal charges against all the miners who surrendered to the federal troops. The federal government was like, nah, because it was evident to one and all that any federal investigation into the miners' uprising would inevitably focus public attention on the close ties between West Virginia coal operators and Republican office holders. So Morgan was like, fine, our state will prosecute them then. And during the winter of 1921 through the spring of 1922, the state indicted over 500 miners with charges ranging from murder, conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, and treason against the state. Specifically, treason charges were leveled against Keeney, Mooney, and another Union leader, Bill Blizzard, all integral in unionizing the area in the early 1900s. All of these trials were very important because if the miners and the Union lost, it would essentially give the go-ahead to anti-Union tactics the mine operators were using, and it could spread into other industries across the country. The trials were conducted in Jefferson County, which was 250 miles away, in an attempt to have an impartial jury. And interestingly, Jefferson County is one of only 3 counties in the whole state that had no coal mining operations in it. The first to be tried was Bill Blizzard, who was recognized as the leader of the march on Logan County, but witnesses gave conflicting testimony of whether he was even there at Blair Mountain or not. After several weeks at trial, Blizzard was acquitted in May of 1922, which represented a major blow to the anti-Union forces in West Virginia and the rest of the nation. An interesting side note Green makes in this book is that the courthouse is the same one that John Brown was tried and sentenced to death in several decades earlier, also for the act of treason for attempting to lead a slave rebellion. And I actually covered this story in the slave rebellion episode if you want to know more. So again, this is one of those really interesting through lines, or, just a very odd coincidence that such a pivotal moment in history with another rebellion and treason trial, we see ourselves in the same position, a few decades later. And then another, for all my history nerds out there, the West Virginia University Library has court documents that you can view online. The link is in the episode description. And I don't know, I just think it's really interesting to see, primary sources and historical documents. So yeah, check it out. Although the treason trials ended up being a major turning point for the American labor movement, the United Miners Union actually went bankrupt with all the trials. And this effectively ended the union's labor organizing efforts in West Virginia. So it was really a bittersweet moment with all the acquittals in the treason trials. So, in that regards, it was a major win for the Union and the miners. But at the same time, the cost of winning those trials was the Union going bankrupt and them not being able to provide support in West Virginia moving forward. All right, so let's now talk about some of the aftermath. One of the consequences of the Union disappearing from the area, which it's kind of interesting, was actually the rise of the KKK. Green writes, quote, "As the Union disappeared from one colliery after another, black and white workers lost the only basis they had ever had for cooperating with one another. The KKK moved into mining towns like Coalburg, where the Hooded Order appeared in force after a local mining company hired a new group of black workers. The next morning, quote, not a Negro was to be found there," end quote. African-American coal miners gravitated towards the Universal Negro Improvement Association and its nationalistic leader, Marcus Garvey, whom they regarded as a Moses. To their credit, the UMW did regard the Klan as a serious menace to, quote, Union morale and labor consciousness, end quote. In response, Union speakers rose to condemn the KKK at a Union convention in 1924, where the delegates adopted a resolution that would require the expulsion of any members who joined the Klan. So, that's pretty progressive for that time period. So kudos to the UMW. Another shocking outcome for the mine operators, and it's very ironic and sad for the miners themselves, is that the West Virginia mining industry did not become as competitive as the operators thought it would be when the Union was gone. Green writes, quote, "On the eve of the Great Depression, the Appalachian coal industry was the sickest of America's sick industries, and the people who made their living in the mines were among the poorest of the nation's poor. The Wall Street panic in October of 1929 made a bad situation much worse in the nation's crippled bituminous coal industry. In the year ahead, people who lived in the Appalachian mining districts would endure a degree of poverty rarely witnessed in the United States. But just when all hope was thought to have been lost, who steps back in? Our former District 17 leader, Frank Keeney." I imagine, a bunch of sad, depressed coal miners in a bar, lamenting over the conditions, and then Frank Keeney kicks the bar doors open and saves the day. Keeney gets the band back together and convinces Mooney to move back from Texas, and their independent union recruits 23,000 miners in the first 6 months of 1931. However, going back to 1930. Sadly, on November 30th, 1930, Mother Jones died in Silver Springs, Maryland. But a fun fact, a young country singer from Texas, you might know him, his name's Gene Autry. He performed his ballad, "The Death of Mother Jones," that fall on the National Barn Dance radio program and then recorded it. And if you don't know who he is, you should. Another miner and songwriter named Orville Jenks wrote a song called "Sprinkle Coal Dust on My Grave" and recorded it in 1930. In this song, an old coal miner mourns Mother Jones's death and then, foreseeing his own, tells his wife, quote, "Don't forget me, little darling, when they lay me down to rest. Tell my brothers all the loving words I say. Let flowers be forgotten. Sprinkle coal dust on my grave in remembrance of the UMW of A." Despite Keeney getting the band back together and recruiting thousands of miners for his independent union, true reform didn't come to the region until the New Deal era of President FDR in the mid-1930s. The first labor law to be introduced in Congress was called the Norris-LaGuardia Act, named after the senator and representative that introduced the bill in each of their respective chambers. The law basically allowed workers to join unions and organize to be able to negotiate with their employers, all without interference or punishment by the employer. The bill passed both houses by overwhelming majorities so that President Hoover had no choice but to sign the law. Green writes that, quote, "The Norris-LaGuardia Act represented the greatest legislative victory for labor in American history, but it had no immediate effect because trade unions were too weak at the time and their leaders were too timid to test the new law," end quote. Another law that helped the miners was the National Industrial Recovery Act, or NIRA, which was passed on June 16, 1933. This law guaranteed that employees would have the right to organize and bargain collectively through representatives of their own choosing, and that employers couldn't discriminate in hiring union members or those who assisted in union organizing. And the law did this by exempting coal mining and other industries from antitrust prosecution if they agreed to the above terms. These laws reinvigorated the union movement, and the UMW was resurrected. In a sad twist of fate, the UMW president John L. Lewis and his right-hand man, Van A. Bittner, got all the credit for, quote, "finally organizing West Virginia," end quote. But in reality, they were able to take advantage of circumstances beyond their control. Depression conditions that crippled their enemies, and new laws proclaimed the right to organize unions. The kind of legal reforms that Frank Keeney had begged for in 1920 and 1921. Veterans of the mine wars received no recognition for doing the hard field work. No one in the union acknowledged Frank Keeney for his historic role as leader of the state's union miners. And then finally, in late 1933, the union reached an agreement with the Appalachian Mine Operators Association. Quote, "This agreement established an 8-hour workday, a 40-hour work week, and a base rate of pay for West Virginia miners close to the union scale that prevailed in the older unionized bituminous mines of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. The coal companies also agreed to deduct union dues from the miners' pay, accept four-step grievance procedure, grant workers the right to select their own checkweighman, ban payment in scrip, free employees from any obligation to shop at company stores, and to not hire boys under the age of 17 to work in the coal mining fields. A journalist for The New Yorker, Howard Brubaker, wrote at the time, quote, "The defeated mine owners agreed to all the things that deputy sheriffs usually shoot people for demanding," end quote. And then Green writes that this remark, quote, "may have left some readers wondering why so many mine workers had been shot and killed for what had been achieved so swiftly and so peacefully during those first spring weeks of the New Deal. West Virginia mines would no longer be the same hellholes they had been during the 1920s, when 478 workers on average died on the job each year. In the 6 years after the Appalachian Agreement took effect, fatalities in those mines decreased by nearly 1/3, end quote. So was it the greed of the mine operators, and only until they saw the writing on the wall and that when their company started to tank that they agreed to the most basic reforms? It's really sad that so many people lost their lives over the mine operators' greed and what eventually, was agreed to so easily in the end. Like, none of those people had to have died for that. And it was basic, reforms. Like, hey, pay us in real money. Hey, maybe don't let 10-year-old boys work in the mines. Like, they weren't asking for crazy things, and they died for it. It's just very sad. So what happened to our union leaders after the New Deal era laws were implemented? Well, Frank Keeney's new union, the Progressive Miners Union, fought with the UMW in West Virginia, and in some cases, the different union workers literally fought each other in the mine towns. Eventually, the UMW won out, and Frank Keeney left the union movement altogether. He went on to own a nightclub for a while, and then later on worked as a parking lot attendant. He died on May 22nd, 1970, at 88 years old. He outlived all of his union friends and all of his enemies. Green writes that his relatives, quote, "planned what they expected to be a sparsely attended burial service, but to their great surprise, dozens of elderly miners attended his funeral. Relatives reported that some of these men shed tears as they told youngsters their stories from the mine wars when Keeney called them to arms. 'We killed men for him,' said one old peg-legged miner," end quote. Fred Mooney went on to write his autobiography titled Struggle in the Coalfields, the autobiography of Fred Mooney. I couldn't find much more information on him except that he later became despondent and sadly took his own life in 1952. Bill Blizzard was given back his old position as District 17 president for the UMW, but was fired after getting into a fist fight with UMW leader John L. Lewis's younger brother. Blizzard died a few years later in 1958 due to an infection in his leg because he refused to have it amputated. He stated that he'd rather die than have his leg amputated, and that's exactly what happened. Another poignant moment from more recent history that I think is important to mention is the modern-day fight to preserve Blair Mountain from coal mining companies. In June of 2011, 250 people set out from Marmot, West Virginia, on a 50-mile protest march to Blair Mountain. They planned to take the same route the armed miners had taken on their 1921 march into company territory. This time, however, the group's mission was different. They were trying to prevent a mining company from blowing the top off of Blair Mountain so that its machines could strip mine its rich coal deposits. And guess who one of the marchers' organizers was? A history professor by the name of C. Belmont Chuck Keeney, a man who just happened to be Frank Keeney's great-grandson. Now tell me, why did that make me tear up when I first read about it? In 2009, Blair Mountain was added to the National Register of Historic Places, but had the title contested and then removed by coal companies, hence the march in 2011. The marchers were successful, and as of this recording, Blair Mountain is still listed as a National Historic Landmark. And so this is where the National Park Service little rant that I did in the beginning kind of ties in. As I mentioned, that status is now under serious threat again, as there is apparently still a lot of coal in those mountains that the coal companies are very hungry to get their hands on. And, if all goes according to the administration's plans, that land could very likely end up being up for grabs. And so why is this story not more widely known? I had not heard of it, and yet it's one of the largest insurrections. It's the second largest insurrection behind the Civil War. It's not even taught in West Virginia up until more recently. And I feel like one of the reasons might be that, government or government institutions don't want to teach people how much power people can wield when they set aside racial, ethnic, and religious differences to fight for dignity, freedom, and equality. According to Green, one of the reasons U.S. historians have neglected to chronicle the mine wars, it could be that historians who sympathize with the Union cause are reluctant to focus on what happened when Union members picked up arms to fight back against the usually superior forces mobilized by their employers. These sympathetic historians tend to focus their attention on incidents where workers were the victims of violence, like the Railroad Workers' Uprising of 1877 and the Ludlow Massacre of 1914. And then Denise Giardina, the author we mentioned in the beginning, she actually grew up in the same coal fields where the mine wars occurred, and she was astonished to learn after her school years that, quote, West Virginians had fought back against their oppressors, end quote. She now understands that state and local officials wanted to cover up the truth. The reason, according to her, was clear to anyone who grew up in a region where, quote, the coal industry still controlled all, end quote. And she later wrote a novel, like we mentioned, Storming Heaven, and that's based on the coal wars in southern West Virginia from 1890 to 1921. I also wanted to point out that Giardina is also an ordained Episcopal church deacon, a community activist, and a former candidate for governor of West Virginia. In conclusion, the story of the West Virginia coal mine wars is a testament to the power of solidarity. Coal miners, black and white, native-born and immigrant, Protestant and Catholic, set aside their differences to stand together against an industry that sought to exploit them. They knew that their only hope for better wages, safer working conditions, and basic human dignity was in their unity. Their struggle was not just about the mines. It was about the fundamental right to be treated as more than expendable labor. And while their fight came at a great personal cost, it laid the groundwork for the labor rights many workers benefit from today. But the 2011 struggle to protect Blair Mountain is a reminder that the fight is never truly over. The attempt to remove this area from the National Register of Historic Places is not just an attack on a landmark. It's an effort to bury important local history. And in an era where the current government has announced plans to open up public lands to resource extraction and privatization, the struggle of the coal miners echoes forward. Who gets to decide the future of our land, our labor, and our collective history? The coal miners of West Virginia showed us the answer. It belongs to those willing to stand together and fight for it. Thank you for listening to this episode of Learning Out Loud. If you would like to reach out for any topics or comments about any of the episodes, you can email me at learningoutloudpod@gmail.com, or you can find me on Instagram at learningoutloudpod.